December 7th, 2020. Wall Street made an announcement that should have stopped the world. Water, the substance that covers 71% of our planet, the molecule that literally defines whether you live or die, just became a tradable commodity on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. $1.1 billion in futures contracts. Water joined gold, oil, and pork bellies as something hedge funds could bet on, something investors could speculate on, something that Wall Street could profit from. And almost nobody noticed. While you were worried about the pandemic, about lockdowns, about whether your kids could go to school, the financial system quietly did something that changes everything about your future. They took the one resource you absolutely cannot live without, the thing that fell from the sky for free for all of human history, and they turned it into a Wall Street product. But here's what they didn't tell you. This wasn't the beginning of the water crisis. It was the endgame. Because for the last 40 years, while you were sleeping, a pattern has been repeating across the globe. And every single time it happens, the same players profit, the same people suffer, and water gets more expensive while becoming more scarce. This is the story of how the most abundant resource on Earth became the next financial weapon. And if you think your tap water is safe because you live in America, because you're in a developed country, because it couldn't happen here, you need to understand that it already has. The game is over. We just don't know it yet. Let's go back to where this pattern really began. Cochabamba, Bolivia. April 2000. A city of 800,000 people erupts into violence. Not over drugs, not over politics, over water. The government, following orders from the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, privatized the city's water system. They sold it to Aguas del Tunari, a subsidiary of Bechtel Corporation, the massive American construction company. The deal was simple. Give a foreign corporation control over every drop of water in the city. In return, they promised investment, infrastructure, modern efficiency. What actually happened? Water bills doubled overnight, then tripled. Poor families, people making $2 a day, suddenly owed $20 a month just for water. That's not a price increase, that's extortion with a legal contract. But it gets worse. The new law didn't just privatize the pipes and treatment plants, it privatized rain. If you collected rainwater in a barrel on your roof, technically you were stealing from the corporation. If you had a community well that your grandfather dug, that became corporate property. Every molecule of H2O in the region now belonged to shareholders in London and New York. The people fought back. Protests, roadblocks, strikes. The government declared martial law. Police used American-made tear gas against crowds. On April 8th, a 17-year-old student named Victor Hugo Daza was shot in the face by a Bolivian army captain during a protest. Killed for demanding access to water. 6 people died in those protests. Hundreds injured. 200 arrested. But the people won. On April 10th, the government canceled the contract. Bechtel fled the country. The people took back their water. And then Bechtel sued Bolivia for $25 million in lost profits. They took a country with a GDP smaller than Kentucky's to international arbitration, demanding compensation for not being allowed to profit from a resource that fell from the sky. Now fast forward to today. That same pattern, that same playbook, is running in slow motion across the entire world. But it's not just about foreign corporations taking over public utilities anymore. It's about something far more sophisticated, far more permanent, and far more profitable. They learned from Bolivia. They learned that you can't just show up and steal water. You have to financialize it. You have to make it part of the system. You have to turn it into an asset class that generates returns for decades. The modern water grab looks different. It doesn't announce itself with protests and soldiers. It happens in boardrooms, in futures exchanges, in quiet land purchases by billionaires and investment firms. Michael Burry, the guy who predicted the 2008 financial crisis, the subject of The Big Short, has been buying water-rich farmland for over a decade. He told Bloomberg in 2010, "I believe that agricultural land with water on site will be very valuable in the future. I've put a good amount of money into that." Bill Gates is now the largest private farmland owner in America. Not because he wants to be a farmer. Because farmland comes with water rights. Stuart and Linda Resnick, through their company, The Wonderful Company, control massive water resources in California through their stake in the Kern Water Bank. They control enough water to meet the needs of 10 million people. That's 25% of California's ratepayers. One family. And it's not just billionaires. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager with $10 trillion under management, has listed water sustainability as a top investment theme. Investment funds are quietly buying up land around rivers, aquifers, and lakes, especially in drought-prone areas, not for farming, for the water rights that come with the land. They're positioning themselves for a future where water isn't a public utility, it's a revenue stream. The numbers tell the story. The world is losing 324 billion cubic meters of fresh water every year. That's enough to supply 280 million people annually. Just gone. Not because it evaporated, but because of poor land management, deforestation, excessive irrigation, and deliberate policies that treat water as a commodity instead of a human right. 2.1 billion people lack access to safely managed drinking water. That's 1 in 4 people on Earth. By 2025, which is basically now, half the world's population could be living in water-stressed areas. By 2030, water scarcity could displace 700 million people. And by 2040, 1 in 4 children will be living in areas of extremely high water stress. But here's what's interesting. This isn't happening because the planet is running out of water. It's happening because water is being controlled, redirected, and financialized. The scarcity is engineered. So how do you turn water into a profit machine? How do you take something that falls from the sky and build a financial empire around it? There's a 3-stage process, and it's been perfected over the last 40 years by some of the most powerful corporations and financial institutions on Earth. Stage 1 is privatization. You convince governments, usually through organizations like the World Bank or IMF, that private companies can run water systems better than public utilities. You promise efficiency, investment, lower costs. The government, usually desperate for cash or international loans, agrees. The corporation takes over the water system. Then comes stage 2, price increases. Always framed as necessary for infrastructure investment, maintenance, expanding service. The reality? Average water rate increases after privatization, ranging from 46% in the first year to several 100% over time. A study of 34 concessions in Latin America during the 1990s found that 7 out of 10 water concessions had negative rates of return for the public. The private companies profited. The public paid more for worse service. Stage 3 is the permanent lock-in. Long-term contracts, typically 25 to 40 years, that tie the hands of local governments. Arbitration clauses that allow corporations to sue governments if profits are threatened. Legal protections that make reversing privatization nearly impossible without massive financial penalties. This pattern has played out in France, where water prices increased 88% in Buenos Aires under Suez. In South Africa, where Suez took over Cape Town's water in 1994 and raised prices by 600% within 2 years, causing cholera outbreaks when people couldn't afford clean water. In England, where Margaret Thatcher privatized water in 1989 and prices increased 46% in the first year alone. But the corporations learned something important from these failures. You can't just privatize and squeeze. You need to control the entire supply chain. You need to own the source, not just the delivery system. You need to make water a financial instrument that can be traded, hedged, and speculated on. That's where 2020 comes in. That's when Wall Street took water to the next level. And the mechanism they used? You won't believe the name. It's called futures contracts. And the receipt for how they'll profit is wilder than you think. On December 7th, 2020, the CME Group launched the Nasdaq Vels California Water Index futures contract. Let's break down what this actually means, and why it's the most important financial development most people have never heard of. A futures contract is a legal agreement to buy or sell an asset at a predetermined price at a specific time in the future. Farmers have used these for centuries to hedge against crop price fluctuations. You grow corn, you can sell a futures contract in the spring for delivery in the fall at a guaranteed price. If corn prices drop, you're protected. If they rise, you miss out on extra profit, but you have certainty. That's the legitimate use. But futures markets do something else. They allow speculation. Someone who has never grown corn, who will never take delivery of corn, can buy and sell corn futures purely to profit from price movements. Hedge funds, banks, and investors use futures markets to bet on everything from oil to wheat to coffee. Now apply that to water. The California Water Futures contract is tied to the NASDAQ-Vel's California Water Index, which tracks the volume-weighted average price of water rights across California's 5 major watersheds. One futures contract represents 10 acre-feet of water. That's about 3.26 million gallons. Enough for roughly 10 average American families for a year. Here's the critical detail. These futures are cash settled. That means nobody actually delivers water. You don't own physical water. You're betting on the price. If you buy a water futures contract at $496 per acre-foot and the price goes to $600, you make the difference. You never touch water. You just profit from price movements. The CME Group and its supporters claim this is about helping farmers and municipalities hedge against water price volatility. That's the public story. The reality is different. Futures markets do 2 things that benefit financial institutions and hurt regular people. First, they concentrate information and control in the hands of sophisticated investors who can read market signals, front-run positions, and manipulate prices through large trades. Second, they increase price volatility, not decrease it. Look at what happened to food. In the 1990s and early 2000s, food commodities were added to futures markets and derivative products. The United Nations and multiple research organizations have documented that this led to the highest food price volatility in history. Not stability, volatility, which means higher prices for consumers and massive profits for speculators who can play both sides. Pedro Arroyo Agudo, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights to Safe Drinking Water and Sanitation, warned in December 2020 that water is already under extreme threat from a growing population, increasing demands, and grave pollution. I am very concerned that water is now being treated as gold, oil, and other commodities that are traded on Wall Street futures markets. You can't put a value on water as you do with other commodities. Water belongs to everyone and is a public good. But the warning came too late. The market was already live, and here's the insidious part. The water futures market hasn't seen massive trading volume. As of early 2025, peak daily trading rarely exceeded 60 contracts. That's tiny compared to other commodity markets. Critics might say it's not a big deal and nobody's really using it. But that misses the point. The infrastructure is in place. The legal framework exists. The precedent is set. When water scarcity intensifies, when droughts worsen, when climate change makes water supplies more unpredictable, that's when the volume explodes. That's when hedge funds and investment banks pour billions into water futures, driving up prices, creating artificial scarcity through hoarding and speculation, and profiting massively while people struggle to afford water. It's the same pattern as the housing crisis. The financial instruments existed for years before they became weapons. Mortgage-backed securities were created in the 1970s. It took 3 decades before they blew up the global economy. Water futures were created in 2020. We're in the early stage. The explosion comes later. Now let's talk about the second mechanism. Direct ownership. While Wall Street was building the futures market, billionaires and corporations were buying the physical asset. Land with water rights, aquifer access, reservoir control. California's Kern Water Bank is the perfect example. It's an underground water storage facility, the largest of its kind in the United States. It can hold about 1 million acre-feet of water. That's enough for roughly 10 million people for a year. It was built with public money, paid for by California taxpayers, intended to store water for emergencies like droughts or natural disasters. In 1994, during a secret meeting in Monterey, the California Department of Water Resources gave the Kern Water Bank to the Kern County Water Agency. The agency immediately signed it over to the Kern Water Bank Authority, a supposedly public entity that includes one private company, Westside Mutual Water Company, controlled by Paramount Farming Company, the largest agribusiness in the United States owned by the Resnick family. The Resnicks control enough water through this arrangement to supply 25% of California's population. During droughts, when water is scarce, they sell it back to cities at enormous profit. Water that was stored using public infrastructure, paid for by taxpayers, is now being used to enrich private individuals. Michael Burry's strategy is different, but equally revealing. he's not buying water rights directly. He's buying farmland that requires massive amounts of water, specifically almond farms in California. Growing one almond takes 5 liters of water. California grows 80% of the world's almonds. During droughts, many farmers can't afford to keep watering their almond trees. Trees die, farmers go bankrupt. Burry buys their land cheap. But Burry's farms are in areas with reliable water access, either from underground aquifers or from regions with better rainfall. When water becomes scarce, his farms keep producing while competitors shut down. His almonds get more valuable. His land appreciates. He's not betting on almonds. He's betting on water scarcity, making his water-rich land irreplaceable. And it's not just California. Investment firms are doing this globally. In Australia, foreign investors own about 15% of water rights. In Africa and South America, Chinese and American agricultural companies are buying vast tracts of land, not for the soil quality, but for the water underneath. The technical term is water grabbing. The reality is neocolonialism using H2O as the weapon. The third mechanism is control of infrastructure. Veolia and Suez, the two French water giants founded in 1853 and 1880 respectively, operate water systems in over 100 countries. They run the pipes, treatment plants, and distribution networks. When they enter a city, they sign 25 to 40-year contracts with guaranteed rate increases, minimum profit margins, and arbitration clauses. If a city tries to back out, like Paris did in 2010 after discovering financial irregularities and excessive pricing, it costs hundreds of millions in legal fees and buyout payments. Paris successfully remunicipalized its water system, but it took years of political will and enormous public expense. Most cities don't have that option. Once privatized, they're locked in. And here's the fourth mechanism, the one most people don't know about. Export control. Countries that control water sources upstream can weaponize water against countries downstream. India and Pakistan have been in a perpetual state of tension over the Indus River system. The Indus Waters Treaty, signed in 1960 and mediated by the World Bank, divided 6 rivers between the two countries. India controls the eastern rivers. Pakistan gets the western rivers. For 60 years, the treaty held, surviving 3 wars. But in April 2025, India suspended the treaty, citing terrorism concerns. Prime Minister Modi announced, "Now India's water will flow for India's benefit. It will be conserved for India's benefit, and it will be used for India's progress." Pakistan responded that any attempt to stop water flow would be considered an act of war. We're talking about 2 nuclear powers threatening conflict over water. The Indus Basin supplies water to nearly 300 million people. 90% of Pakistan's food production and 65% of its employment depend on agriculture sustained by the Indus. If India blocks those rivers, Pakistan faces famine, economic collapse, and mass migration. Similar tensions exist between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt over the Nile, between Turkey, Syria, and Iraq over the Tigris and Euphrates, between Israel and Palestine over the Jordan River. Water isn't just being financialized, it's being weaponized. Now, let's tie this together with specific numbers that show the scale. Global water demand has increased by 25% since 2000. A third of that increase is in areas already experiencing freshwater scarcity. Central America, Eastern Europe, Northern India, Southeastern Brazil. Global water demand is projected to increase by another 20 to 30% by 2050. At the same time, supply is shrinking. Glaciers, which provide fresh water to billions of people, lost more than 600 gigatons of water in 2023. That's the largest mass loss registered in the last 5 decades. Climate change is accelerating glacier melt, which means short-term flooding followed by long-term water shortage. The Himalayas and Hindu Kush glaciers supply water to nearly 2 billion people in India, Pakistan, China, and Southeast Asia. Around 1/3 of these glaciers are expected to disappear with just 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit of warming. We're currently on track for over 5 degrees by the end of the century. The economic impact is staggering. The World Bank estimates that water scarcity could cost some regions 6% of GDP by 2050. In sub-Saharan Africa, droughts leave 600,000 to 900,000 people without jobs each year. Women, older individuals, and landless farmers are disproportionately affected. But here's the part that should terrify you. 72% of all freshwater withdrawals are used by agriculture, 16% by industry, 12% by municipalities. That means your tap water, your shower, your toilet, all of it combined represents just 12% of water use. The real battle is over the 72% used to grow food. And that's exactly where the financialization is happening. That's where billionaires are buying land. That's where corporations are controlling supply. That's where futures markets will determine prices. When food production becomes dependent on water controlled by financial speculators and billionaire landowners, food prices don't just go up. They become volatile, unpredictable, and weaponizable. You're not just paying more for water. You're paying more for everything that requires water, which is everything. So where does this leave us? Let's be clear about what's happening. The water crisis is real. Climate change is real. Population growth is real. But the financialization of water isn't a response to the crisis. It's a strategy to profit from it. Every mechanism we've discussed, privatization, futures markets, land grabbing, infrastructure control, they don't solve water scarcity. They monetize it, and the system is accelerating. Since 2020, we've seen water futures trading launch. We've seen investment firms double down on water-rich farmland acquisitions. We've seen treaties like the Indus Waters Agreement collapse. We've seen remunicipalizations in some cities while privatizations expand in others. The pattern is global, coordinated, and deliberate. The lesson from history is simple. When essential resources become financial instruments, the people who control those instruments win and everyone else loses. It happened with housing in 2008. It happened with food in the 2000s. It's happening with water right now. But there's a difference this time. You can live without a house. You can adjust your diet, but you cannot live without water. Not for days. And when the crisis accelerates, when droughts intensify, when glaciers disappear, when rivers run dry, the people who own water rights, who control water infrastructure, who trade water futures, they don't just get rich. They control survival. This isn't conspiracy. This is business. Publicly traded companies have a legal obligation to maximize shareholder value. If water scarcity makes water more valuable and controlling water increases profits, then corporations will control water. It's not evil. It's the system working exactly as designed. The problem is that the system was designed for things like steel and soybeans, not for molecules you need to stay alive. So what happens next? Two scenarios. In scenario 1, governments wake up. They recognize that water is too essential to be treated as a commodity. They reverse privatizations. They regulate futures markets. They enforce water as a human right, not a market product. They invest in public infrastructure, desalination, water recycling, and conservation. Some countries are already doing this. Over 90 cities globally have remunicipalized water systems since 2000, including Paris, Berlin, and dozens of French cities. In scenario 2, the pattern continues. More privatization, more futures trading, more land grabbing, more weaponization. Water bills rise until poor people can't afford them. Shutoffs increase. Public health crises emerge. Countries threaten war over rivers. And through it all, corporations and investors profit while framing it as efficiency, innovation, and market dynamics. Which scenario seems more likely? Look around. Look at who controls policy. Look at who funds politicians. Look at the last 40 years of deregulation, privatization, and financialization. The pattern doesn't lie. We're on the path towards scenario 2. And by the time most people realize what's happened, the infrastructure will be in place. The contracts will be signed, and reversing it will be almost impossible. The question isn't whether we're wiser now than we were in Bolivia in 2000, or England in '89, or anywhere else the water wars have played out. The question is whether we'll act before it's too late. Because unlike those other battles, this one is global, this one is permanent. And this one determines whether future generations pay corporations for the privilege of staying alive. Are we wiser now, or are we just walking the same path in better suits? If this opened your eyes to how deep the water crisis really goes, hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share to people around you. Because when the next stage hits, when water shortages become the dominant crisis of our time, you'll want to understand not just what's happening, but who's profiting and why. The answers are already here. You just have to know where to look. Thanks for watching. Click the next video for another revealing narrative.